160 degrees. 21 days. Heat kills faster than bullets. American forces engage Iranian troops in desert where ground temperature reaches 160 Fahrenheit and air temperature exceeds 130. 3 weeks where modern military equipment fails from heat. Water becomes more valuable than ammunition, and survival requires fighting sun as much as enemy. 7,000 American troops against 20,000 Iranian forces in an environment where heat stroke kills in minutes and metal surfaces burn flesh on contact. But there's something about this desert warfare that contradicts every principle of modern combat. Something discovered on day 11 that changes everything. And when you understand what that was, this entire campaign suddenly reveals why some environments create conditions where technology becomes liability and primitive survival skills matter more than advanced training. But here's what they won't tell you about fighting at 160 degrees for 3 weeks. The heat doesn't just exhaust soldiers, it destroys them. Equipment overheats and fails. Vehicles break down from thermal stress. Electronics shut down from excessive temperature. Water consumption becomes so massive that logistics can't keep pace. At day 14, more American casualties came from heat-related illness than from Iranian fire. And the reason forces stayed in desert that was killing them wasn't tactical necessity. It was strategic miscalculation that made admitting defeat more costly than accepting casualties from environment that treated both sides as prey. Recently, intelligence indicated Iranian military activity in extreme desert region. Forces establishing positions in area where temperatures routinely exceeded 130 Fahrenheit and ground temperature reached 160. U.S. response was military deployment. 7,000 troops tasked with neutralizing Iranian presence before they consolidated control of strategic position. What should have been 7-day operation became 21-day ordeal, where heat proved deadlier than combat and survival, required accepting that nature was more powerful than any military force. Welcome to the Navy Chronicle, where we decode operations that prove some environments are beyond human capacity to wage war effectively, and some battles are lost to nature before enemy fires first shot. The Iranian desert was strategic location, controlled approach routes, provided surveillance positions. Iranian forces had occupied during cooler months, built infrastructure, established defensive positions, but had withdrawn during summer when temperatures became extreme. Intelligence suggested they'd left minimal forces. Americans could seize positions before Iranians returned in fall. U.S. forces deployed 7,000 troops, assuming brief operation. Intelligence indicated 20,000 Iranians in region, but most had withdrawn to cooler areas. Americans would establish presence, fortify positions, force Iranians to assault defended positions when they returned. Classic strategy of seizing terrain and making enemy retake it at disadvantage. Planning assumed 7 days maximum in extreme heat. Would seize positions quickly. Rotate troops to avoid extended heat exposure. Complete operation before heat casualties became significant. Timeline was based on desert temperature data that proved to be catastrophically optimistic. Day 1. American forces entered desert. Temperature was 128 Fahrenheit in shade, and there was no shade. Ground temperature was 155 Fahrenheit. Metal equipment was too hot to touch. Initial advance was slower than planned. Soldiers required frequent water breaks. Heat exhaustion cases appeared within hours. This was worse than training had prepared for. Day 2. First heat casualties. 3 soldiers died from heat stroke despite immediate treatment. 12 evacuated with severe heat illness. Temperature reached 132 Fahrenheit. Ground temperature measured 162 Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe burns from brief contact. Americans realized they'd underestimated environmental challenge. Day 3. Iranian resistance appeared. Not withdrawal as intelligence suggested. Iranians had remained in desert, were operating effectively in conditions Americans were struggling with. First engagement showed Iranians had adapted to extreme heat, were moving during cooler morning and evening hours. sheltering during peak afternoon heat. Americans were trying to maintain normal operational tempo and being destroyed by environment. Day 4. American casualties. 8 killed from heat-related causes, 40 evacuated with heat illness. 3 combat deaths. 51 total casualties before completing first week. Iranian casualties estimated at minimal. They weren't engaging heavily, were letting heat kill Americans while conserving their own strength. Day 5. Equipment failures began. Vehicles overheating despite cooling systems. Electronics failing from excessive temperature. Weapons too hot to handle safely. Ammunition experiencing temperature-related malfunctions. Modern military technology was being defeated by heat that exceeded design specifications. Day 7. 1 week in extreme desert. American casualties. 24 killed from heat causes, 180 evacuated with heat illness, 12 combat deaths. Total 216 casualties. 3.1% casualty rate. Iranian casualties estimated at 40 plus, but Iranians maintained operational effectiveness while Americans were being degraded by environment. U.S. command faced reality. Operation was failing, not from military defeat, but from environmental defeat. Heat was destroying American combat capability faster than Iranians needed to fight. But withdrawal would mean acknowledging failure and abandoning strategic objectives. Political pressure forced continuation, despite casualties. Day 10. Americans adapted tactics. Stopped daytime operations. Moved only during night and early morning. Sheltered during afternoon peak heat. Built shade structures. Focused on survival rather than aggressive operations. This was admission that environment had defeated conventional tactics. We're fighting to survive until mission could be completed, or withdrawal became politically acceptable. Iranian forces adapted too. Began aggressive daytime operations when Americans were sheltered and vulnerable. Exploited American environmental weakness. This was asymmetric warfare where Iranians used heat as weapon, and Americans were victims of their own equipment and doctrine that wasn't designed for sustained operations at 160 degrees. Day 11. This is where Americans discovered truth about Iranian desert operations that changed understanding of entire campaign. Iranians weren't just adapted to heat, they were thriving in it. Had underground shelters providing cool refuge. Had developed tactics specifically for extreme heat warfare. Had equipment rated for temperatures Americans couldn't match. This wasn't improvisation. Was years of preparation for desert warfare at temperatures that Americans considered beyond operational limits. More significantly, Iranians had created advantage through environmental preparation. Desert that was killing Americans was terrain. Iranians had turned into weapon system. Every American casualty from heat was Iranian victory without firing shot. This was environmental warfare where defender had home advantage that technology couldn't overcome. Discovery reframed mission. Americans weren't fighting Iranian military in neutral terrain. We're fighting Iranian military in environment Iranians had weaponized through preparation and adaptation. Heat wasn't equal challenge. Was asymmetric advantage that favored defenders who'd prepared while attackers relied on technology that failed in extreme conditions. Stay with me. What happened on day 14 proved that continuing operation was strategic mistake, driven by political considerations that ignored tactical reality, where environment was supreme enemy. Day 14. 2 weeks at 160 degrees. American casualties, 68 killed from heat causes, 420 evacuated with heat illness, 28 combat deaths. Total, 516 casualties, 7.4% casualty rate. Iranian casualties, estimated at 180 plus, but Iranians maintained defensive positions and operational capability, while Americans continued degrading. Temperature remained 130 plus Fahrenheit daily. Ground temperature, consistently above 160. Americans were surviving but couldn't operate effectively. Water consumption was exceeding resupply capability. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with heat casualties. Equipment failures were mounting. This was defeat in progress that political leadership wouldn't acknowledge. Day 15. American forces attempted major operation. Coordinated assault on Iranian positions. Using night movement to avoid peak heat. Largest effort since deployment. This was attempt to achieve objective that would justify casualties and allow withdrawal with success claimed. Iranian defense was effective. Had prepared positions. Knew terrain intimately. Fought brief engagement, then withdrew to underground shelters Americans couldn't reach without exposing themselves to daytime heat. American assault achieved limited gains at cost of 40 more casualties, mix of combat and heat injuries from exertion in extreme temperature. Day 17. American command made decision. Operation would continue until strategic objectives achieved regardless of casualties. This was political decision that overrode military reality. Forces would remain in desert, accepting environmental casualties until Iranians were defeated or withdrawn. Timeline extended indefinitely, despite casualty rates that would normally terminate operations. Day 18. Americans began suffering from cumulative heat exposure. Soldiers who'd survived 2 weeks were showing chronic effects. Reduced cognitive function, diminished physical capacity, increased susceptibility to heat illness. Even with adaptation, sustained exposure and at 160 degrees was degrading human capability beyond recovery through rest and hydration. Iranian forces showed similar effects, but less severe. Home advantage and better preparation meant Iranians could sustain operations longer than Americans in extreme heat. This was asymmetric warfare, where environmental advantage was decisive and technology couldn't compensate for lack of adaptation. Day 20. 3 weeks approaching. American casualties: 120 killed from heat causes, 680 evacuated with heat illness, 48 combat deaths. Total 848 casualties. 12.1% casualty rate. Iranian casualties estimated at 400 plus, but Iranians held positions and showed no signs of withdrawing despite their own losses. Strategic objectives remained unachieved. Americans controlled perhaps 30% of desired terrain. Iranians held strategic positions. Stalemate was developing where neither side could achieve victory, but Americans were paying higher price in environmental casualties for partial success. Day 21. Decision reached at highest levels. Operation would conclude. Americans would withdraw with positions held claimed as success. Iranians would retain most strategic terrain. Both sides would claim victory. Both sides would exit desert that was killing them impartially. Final casualties. American forces: 140 killed from heat-related causes, 780 evacuated with heat illness, 56 combat deaths. Total 976 casualties. 13.9% casualty rate. Iranian forces: estimated 520 killed or wounded including environmental casualties. 2.6% casualty rate from larger force that was better adapted to extreme heat. Now here's complete truth that reframes entire 21-day heat apocalypse. Operation failed strategically while succeeding politically. Americans withdrew claiming partial success but had achieved few objectives. Paid 13.9% casualty rate, mostly environmental, for territorial gains that didn't justify human cost. Iranian forces maintained control of strategic positions, accepting smaller casualty rate, while defending an environment they'd prepared to weaponize. Heat killed 140 Americans, more than twice combat deaths. This proved that desert warfare at 160 degrees is beyond current American military capability for sustained operations. Technology that should provide advantage failed from temperature. Doctrine that should ensure success didn't account for environment where human limits are reached, regardless of training or equipment. 21 days proved some environments create insurmountable tactical problems. Iranian preparation and adaptation created asymmetric advantage that American technology couldn't overcome. Heat was weapon that favored defenders who'd trained for it while attackers relied on equipment that failed when temperatures exceeded design limits. Remember, Day 11 discovery that Iranians had weaponized heat. That explained entire campaign. Iranians deliberately operated in extreme desert, knowing Americans would follow into environment that favored defenders. This was strategic use of terrain, where heat did most of killing and Iranian forces just needed to survive better than Americans to win. Remember, equipment failures from excessive temperature. That proved modern military technology has environmental limits. Systems rated for desert operations failed when temperatures reached 160. Electronics, vehicles, weapons, all designed for extreme heat, but all failed when reality exceeded specifications. This is limitation of technology that some environments expose. Remember, 13.9% casualty rate with 140 heat deaths. That proved some operations shouldn't be attempted in conditions beyond human tolerance, regardless of strategic importance. Accepting casualties from environment that exceed combat losses for objectives that weren't achieved is military failure that political considerations forced, despite tactical reality. Quick question. In 21-day operation, where Americans took 13.9% casualties, mostly from heat, while achieving partial objectives, and Iranians took 2.6% casualties while retaining strategic positions, who won? A. Americans through partial success. B. Iranians through defensive victory. C. Heat through killing both sides. D. Politicians who claimed success despite failure. Real answer is B. Iranians won by using environmental advantage to inflict casualties while retaining strategic terrain. Americans paid blood price for partial success that didn't justify casualties accepted for political considerations that overrode military reality. The Navy Chronicle decodes operations that prove environmental warfare is most effective asymmetric strategy when defender can weaponize terrain and attacker relies on technology that fails when nature becomes supreme enemy. The 21-day campaign ended. Americans withdrew claiming success despite failing to achieve strategic objectives. 140 Americans dead from heat. 780 evacuated with injuries that will affect them permanently. 56 combat deaths were minority compared to environmental casualties. Iranians retained strategic positions, having proven that extreme desert is environment where preparation and adaptation defeat technology and training that aren't designed for sustained operations at temperatures that exceed human tolerance. And somewhere, military planners study operation, write reports about environmental warfare, develop new doctrine for extreme heat operations. But real lesson can't be taught in classroom or simulated in training. Can only be learned by soldiers who fought at 160 degrees for 3 weeks and discovered that some environments are beyond human capacity to wage war effectively, regardless of technology or tactics. Lesson is that nature is supreme when conditions reach extremes and military forces that can't adapt to environment lose battles before engaging enemy. Welcome to Heat Apocalypse, where 160 degrees proved nature is deadliest enemy. Where 21 days cost 13.9% American casualties and most weren't from combat. Where Iranian environmental advantage defeated American technological superiority through preparation that weaponized terrain. Where soldiers learned that some battles are lost to heat before enemy fires first shot, and some environments create conditions where survival matters more than victory because both are impossible when temperature alone kills faster than weapons. The Navy Chronicle, where the 21-day heat apocalypse proved desert at 160 degrees is beyond sustained military operations and environmental warfare defeats technology when nature becomes weapon that defender controls and attacker can't overcome.